A French army doctor is standing in the North African desert in 1844, watching his soldiers drop from dysentery and malaria faster than any enemy could take them out. He reaches for a bottle of green liquid, not as a luxury, not as a celebration, but as medicine. He mixes it into their water rations and orders them to drink. That was 1844. By 1870, that same green liquid would be blamed for driving an entire generation of Parisian artists completely out of their minds. This is the story of absinthe. If you had asked anyone in a French colonial outpost about absinthe back in the 1840s, they would have told you it was field medicine, nothing more. A bitter herbal tonic that kept your stomach settled and the fever away. They had no idea what it was about to become. The drink itself was not a military invention. A French doctor named Pierre Ordinaire had created the original recipe decades earlier, sometime in the 1790s, while living in a small Swiss town called Cuvée. Ordinaire combined wormwood, anise, and fennel with a collection of other herbs, distilled the whole thing into a high-proof spirit, and marketed it as a cure-all. The locals called it La Fée Verte, the green fairy, because of its distinctive emerald color. When Ordinaire died, the recipe passed through a few hands before landing with a man named Henri-Louis Pernod. Pernod saw something beyond folk medicine. He opened the first absinthe distillery in 1805, just across the Swiss border in Pontarlier, France. Production scaled up fast. The French government, always looking for ways to keep its colonial soldiers alive and functional, started purchasing absinthe in bulk for troops stationed in Algeria and other North African territories. The logic was straightforward. Wormwood, the key ingredient, had been used as an anti-malarial for centuries. Mixing it into the soldiers' drinking water helped kill the bacteria that caused dysentery and other waterborne diseases. The high alcohol content did the rest. For the French military in the 1840s and 1850s, absinthe was essentially a portable water purification system that also happened to take the edge off a brutal deployment. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. When those soldiers came home from North Africa, they brought their taste for absinthe with them. These were not artists or philosophers. They were regular military men who had developed a genuine fondness for the bitter green spirit during years of colonial service. They started ordering it in the cafes and brasseries of Paris, Lyon, and Marseille. Bartenders scrambled to stock it, and within a decade, absinthe went from a military footnote to one of the most popular drinks in France. The timing could not have been better for absinthe, or worse for the French wine industry. In the 1860s, a microscopic insect called phylloxera began devastating vineyards across France. The bug ate through grapevine roots, and within 20 years, it had destroyed roughly 40% of all French vineyards. Wine production collapsed, prices shot up, and suddenly, absinthe was not only fashionable, it was affordable. A glass of absinthe cost significantly less than a glass of wine. By the 1870s and 1880s, absinthe had conquered Paris. The late afternoon became known as l'heure verte, the green hour, when the cafes along the Grands boulevards filled with the distinctive pale green glow of absinthe glasses lined up on zinc countertops. Workers drank it, businessmen drank it, housewives drank it, and, most famously, the artists drank it. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. The people who would make absinthe legendary were not celebrating it. They were self-medicating with it. The Parisian bohemian scene of the late 19th century was an extraordinary concentration of creative talent living in extraordinary poverty. And absinthe became the drug of choice for nearly all of them. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec carried a hollow walking cane filled with absinthe, so he would never be without it. Paul Verlaine, the poet, drank so much of it that his behavior became genuinely dangerous, and he eventually shot his lover, the young poet Arthur Rimbaud, during an absinthe-fueled argument. Edgar Degas painted L'Absinthe in 1876, depicting two figures in a cafe looking hollow-eyed and defeated, their glasses of green liquid sitting in front of them like quiet accusations. And then there was Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh was a dedicated absinthe drinker during his time in Paris and later in Arles. For decades, people pointed to his increasingly wild brushwork, his swirling skies, his vivid yellows and greens, and said the absinthe did that. They said the wormwood was making him hallucinate, that the drink was literally rewiring his perception of reality, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid as a medical diagnosis. Because here is what was actually happening. The ritual of drinking absinthe was genuinely unusual compared to other spirits, and that ritual fed the mystique. You placed a sugar cube on a special slotted spoon balanced across the rim of your glass. You slowly dripped ice-cold water over the sugar cube, and as the sweetened water hit the absinthe, the clear green liquid turned cloudy and opalescent. The French called this la louche, the clouding. The whole process was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. In a culture that was already obsessed with aesthetics and ritual, absinthe was not just a drink, it was a performance. Now, the bohemian crowd was drinking absinthe at an astonishing rate, and many of them were clearly suffering. Verlaine's violent episodes, Van Gogh's mental deterioration, the general air of madness that seemed to follow the drink wherever it went. In 3 years, Verlaine would understand exactly what all that absinthe had cost him. Sitting in a hospital ward, unable to walk. But the question nobody was asking carefully enough was simple. Was the absinthe causing the madness? Or were already troubled people simply drawn to the most available and cheapest strong drink around? The medical establishment of the time did not bother with that distinction. In the 1860s and 1870s, a French psychiatrist named Valentine Magnan began conducting experiments on animals using pure wormwood oil. He exposed guinea pigs and dogs to concentrated wormwood extract and observed seizures. He then pointed to the tremors and erratic behavior of heavy absinthe drinkers and declared that he had found the cause. He called it absinthism, a distinct condition separate from ordinary alcoholism. According to Magnan, the chemical compound thujone found in wormwood was a neurotoxin that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and eventual insanity. And somehow, it gets worse. Magnan's research was deeply flawed. He was giving his test animals doses of pure wormwood oil that were hundreds of times more concentrated than anything a human would consume by drinking absinthe. The amount of thujone in a typical glass of absinthe was negligible. You would die of alcohol poisoning long before you consumed enough thujone to cause seizures. But Magnan's conclusions sounded scientific. They confirmed what a nervous public already wanted to believe, and they spread through the medical community like wildfire. The wine industry saw an opportunity. With vineyards slowly recovering from phylloxera, winemakers were desperate to reclaim market share. They funded temperance campaigns that specifically targeted absinthe while conveniently leaving wine alone. Posters appeared across France depicting absinthe as a green demon, strangling families, destroying communities, and driving men to murder. The message was clear: wine was civilized, absinthe was poison. If you're finding this interesting, hit subscribe. I break down stories like this every week. By 1905, the campaign found its perfect weapon. A Swiss farmer named Jean Lanfray murdered his pregnant wife and 2 daughters after a day of extremely heavy drinking. Lanfray had consumed wine, cognac, brandy, crème de menthe, and 2 glasses of absinthe over the course of that day. But the newspapers did not call it a wine killing or a brandy killing. They called it an absinthe murder. The 2 glasses of absinthe became the headline. Everything else he drank that day was barely mentioned. The Lanfray case was a warning sign that moral panic had completely overtaken rational analysis. Everyone ignored it. The bans came fast after that. Switzerland prohibited absinthe in 1910. The Netherlands followed in 1910 as well. The United States banned it in 1912. France, the country most associated with absinthe, finally outlawed it in 1915, framing the prohibition as a wartime measure to protect the health of soldiers heading to the front lines of World War I. That's the kind of irony that makes accountants cry. The drink that was first given to soldiers to keep them healthy was eventually taken away from soldiers for the exact same reason. But this was not just about absinthe anymore. The entire episode revealed something uncomfortable about how societies decide what is dangerous and what is acceptable. Wine, which contributed to just as much alcoholism, violence, and disease, was never seriously threatened. It had economic power, cultural prestige, and a lobby. Absinthe, associated with bohemians, immigrants, and the working poor, was an easy target. The science against it was bad, the economics against it were ruthless, and the morality campaign against it was pure theater. For nearly a century, absinthe stayed banned across most of the Western world. The legends only grew during that time. The Green Fairy became synonymous with artistic madness, with creative genius fueled by hallucination. Movies and books reinforced the idea that absinthe was somehow fundamentally different from other spirits, that it contained something that altered consciousness in ways that went beyond simple intoxication. The real question is what happened behind the laboratory doors when modern chemists finally decided to test those claims. In the 1990s and early 2000s, researchers began analyzing vintage bottles of pre-ban absinthe, the actual stuff that Toulouse-Lautrec and Van Gogh had been drinking, and what they found demolished the mythology. The thujone levels in those bottles were extremely low, typically around 25 milligrams per liter or less. Modern toxicological studies showed that you would need to consume massive quantities to experience any neurological effects from thujone, far beyond what any human could survive from the alcohol alone. The hallucinations that artists reported were almost certainly the result of drinking a spirit that was typically between 55 and 72% alcohol by volume. That is stronger than most vodkas, most whiskeys, and most gins. If you drink enough of anything that strong, your perception of reality is going to shift. You do not need a magical herb for that. You just need enough ethanol and bad judgment. The scientists found no evidence whatsoever that absinthe caused effects distinct from any other high-proof spirit. Absinthism, the terrifying condition that Valentine Magnan had described and that had justified decades of prohibition, simply did not exist. One by one, the bans started falling. The Netherlands re-legalized absinthe in 2004. Switzerland reversed its ban in 2005. France formally re-legalized it in 2011. The United States allowed it back in 2007, with the regulation that thujone levels stay below 10 milligrams per liter, a limit that most traditional absinthe recipes already met without any modification. Today, you can walk into a bar in Paris, New York, or Zurich and order an absinthe the same way someone would have in 1875, complete with the slotted spoon, the sugar cube, and the cold water drip. The ritual survived a century of prohibition, essentially unchanged, and that might be the most remarkable part of this entire story. The drink itself was never what people feared. What they feared was what it represented. Absinthe was the drink of outsiders, of people who rejected respectable society, of artists who prioritized creative obsession over stability. The ruling class looked at the people drinking it, decided those people were dangerous, and then built a scientific excuse to take their drink away. Van Gogh's mental illness was real, but it was not caused by absinthe. Verlaine's violence was real, but it was not caused by absinthe. The poverty and suffering of the Parisian bohemian scene were very real, but absinthe was a symptom of that world, not the cause. What survived was not the madness, and not the moral panic, and not the junk science. What survived was the drink itself, the green color, the anise bite, the ritual with the spoon and the sugar, and the slow water drip. After 100 years of being called poison, the Green Fairy outlasted every single one of its accusers. If you want to see another story about how fear and bad science rewrote history, click the video on screen now. And if you made it this far, subscribe. I will see you in the next one.